Hello, dear viewer. Have you ever thought about what makes a good adaptation? Maybe you've been a fan of something, a book perhaps, and years later the malevolent forces in Hollywood decide to churn out an adaptation that doesn't meet your expectations in the slightest. Or, if you're one of the lucky ones, then a competent team from a morally dubious studio, trust me, that's a preferred type, decide to create a faithful adaptation, and it turns out to be so good that you find a respite in this miserable life. You were joyous because you got to watch something so good come to life on the silver screen or television. That works too. I'm not biased. How about if you read something and that becomes the inspiration for a video game which you thoroughly enjoy? Another positive outcome. But how about that same thing happening, only the game turns out to be an absolute pile of garbage? I mean, the biggest piece of dog shit you've ever seen. Tricky, isn't it? Most people read books, comics, whatever, because they've heard it's good or like the author. And I'm not about to get into the reason why people happen upon the media they consume. But what matters is that if you have a base, a source material, some would say the infamous or famous source material in which something is based on. It could be a famous manga or a cult science fiction novel from Russia, which was published in 1971 and written by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. A fairly specific example, but that's my source material, dear viewer. You see, I don't like science fiction. I don't read, actually. As Little Pump once said, I like looking at pictures. However, for this particular novel, I decided to read it before playing the game on which it was based on. Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl. The Stalker video games in general, actually. In a weird instance, the product of adaptation led me to the source material. But if you know a little bit about the Japanese anime industry, you'd know that's probably the main goal for any publisher pimping out their IP. When I read Roadside Picnic, I was surprised about how good it was. So good, in fact, I binged the book. Crazy. How can a person binge a book in this day and age? Anyway, I was surprised to find a very nuanced look into the relationship between humanity and extraterrestrial intelligence. Where most works of science fiction would make humans equal or far inferior to the aliens they encounter, Roadside Picnic interprets a potential alien encounter as something more detached and not as spectacular as other works. I'm not going to spoil the book because I truly believe that you should read it if you're interested in a compelling science fiction novel. However, I will discuss aspects such as the zone that feature prominently throughout the novel. And it's right here, look, it's right here. But dear viewer, you already know the video game that uses Roadside Picnic as inspiration. But what about the other example? What about the movie? That would be Stalker, the movie. The names are the same. I know, confusing. But I'll try to differentiate them whenever possible, dear viewer. Roadside Picnic is the base, and the movie and the game take key aspects from the novel and work it into their respective medias. Both the game and the movie have stalkers, the zone, some form of the witch granter, and the act of throwing boats to orientate yourself while traversing through the zone. That's where the similarities end, however, for these two adaptations could not be more different. Whereas the movie approaches the zone as more of a religious and philosophical quandary to be pondered, with stalkers being the shepherds for representatives of humanity's different facets of belief, the game is definitely a lot more simpler, making the zone the game map and a player a stalker. However, even though the movie sounds like a more faithful adaptation due to the nature of humans interpreting complex to mean better, I would argue that both of these adaptations are inadequate, although I will say that Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl is exponentially better than the movie. I would rather eat rocks and die before having to watch that Stalker movie again. Seriously. My idea of a proper adaptation is a one-to-one, a simple recreation of the material found within whatever is being adapted. However, the best adaptations are the ones that examine the source material and either add or remove aspects to enhance the overall story. An example would be Harry Potter movies streamlining a lot of the mess that J.K. Roll Over and Die was writing. But what about this particular movie and video game? Well, I think it's time to stop beating around the bush and really see why the Stalker movie from 1979 is so horrid. First and foremost, I didn't do any research into the context of this movie because I didn't want to. Frankly, it doesn't matter because the butchering of the characters and loss of nuance is the biggest sin this movie commits. Actually, scrap that. I know the biggest problem with this movie. It's that it's the most boring thing I've ever seen. The funny thing is, I was looking forward to this movie. I had just finished the book and I was hyped that there was a movie for me to watch, but what I got was nearly 3 hours of nothing. Because that's what the movie is, nothing. You could say that there's some deep philosophical message here that really strikes at the soul, and the cinematography and the direction of the movie hammer in those messages. But no, that doesn't happen here at all. How is it possible that a movie is so boring and makes reading a book the better alternative? The book had a nuanced philosophical discussion that could easily call the climax of the novel, the entire reason for it being written, I would argue, and it was far from boring. So how come the movie can't do the same? I'll tell you why, because the movie decides to jump through rings and do backflips to switch up the characters and the story so much that it becomes a shallow reflection of the book. The biggest character assassination in the movie is when the Stalker, whose name is Redrick Schuhart, say his name, pours out an entire bottle of vodka, presumably, I'm not an expert in liquor, into the grass. Why does our Stalker protagonist do this when in the novel, Red is constantly thinking about taking a drink from his flask? Because in the movie they alter his character so much, they create a religious fanatic who wants to save humanity from itself, probably. Like I said, it was so boring and uninteresting that I was falling asleep towards the end. And it was in the middle of the afternoon, so it was a snooze fest. Anyway, Red in the book is worried about his family and making money, and coming out of the zone alive and dealing with Vulture and anybody else who wants to get in his way. It's only at the end of the book when he's contemplating the larger picture and his place in the world, but having his entire persona be of a zealot who worships the zone is ridiculous. And don't get me started what they did to Guta. Guta, who is Red's girlfriend and later wife in the novel, is admittedly underutilized in the story, but is written carefully, with her emotions being very precisely detailed so that you have to infer minor movements with hands or facial expressions to try to understand how she truly feels. It's subtle and interesting, but the Guta in the movie is so over the top it borders on ridiculousness. The movie also removes the shady underbelly aspect of the zone, the finding and selling of counterfeit goods for money, which makes life outside the zone feel more believable and real, because of course a criminal element to an unexplainable phenomenon would occur. People love a quick buck in any circumstance, but all the sauce that made the book special has been stripped out and filled with something inferior, making the movie a failure of an adaptation and even a failure as a standalone movie, because if the movie is so boring that it makes the viewer want to watch something else, then you know you fucked up somewhere. Moving on to the other notable adaptation, that being the Stalker video games. Interestingly though, the most that the games take from the book is the zone, bolts to disrupt traps, stalkers, and the different artifacts that can be found and either equipped or sold for money, or coupons in this case. Which brings me to another question. How much can you change from the source material before it becomes something else entirely? I think that the Stalker video games are something else entirely, but that doesn't inherently mean that they're bad. Far from it. I very much believe that these games are one of a kind, flawed and far from perfect. Much better example of an adaptation than the movie. Recall another question I asked earlier. What constitutes a good adaptation? Another answer to this vague question could be understanding the theme that the source material is attempting to portray and extract that theme and impose it onto something else. You could change it however much you want it, but it retains those core thematic qualities found within the source material. It could be argued that it's a good adaptation. The situation of the Stalker video games is an interesting one. The novel Roadside Picnic was published in 1971, 15 years before the Chornobyl power plant disaster in Ukraine. The book talked about exclusion zones being formed to restrict access to the locations where the aliens landed on Earth. And here you have a real-life exclusion zone being created because of a nuclear power plant malfunctioning. But the writers for Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, the first game in the series, didn't stop there. They created another incident in the same reactor plant, causing the anomalies that were present within the novel to begin appearing in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. They changed and modernized the original text, but still retained the core thematic values. Obviously, similarities like the zone and Stalkers are obvious, but there's also the sense of freedom that is found within the game that mirrors the desire for individual freedom in the book. In the zone, the game zone, it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care who you were in the mainland, and it's not interested who your parents were. None of the chains found in society are present in the zone. All that matters is what you decide to do with your life. Whether you choose to retain the freedom gifted to you and become a loner or stalker, or choose to retain your familiar bonds and join one of the many groups found within the zone, except for monoliths, you don't have a choice. Would a more one-to-one adaptation been better for the Stalker video games? No, I don't think so. I fully believe that the Stalker video games are a good adaptation of the book because they retain the novel's core value of freedom and the ability to choose, of being confronted with the unknown but still retaining the desire of choice and living on your own ability. I wish I was able to explain it in a more eloquent way, but unfortunately I'm an idiot. However, what I can explain is this controversial opinion about Stalker 2: Heart of Chernobyl. I'm gonna catch a lot of flack for this. I think the game is great. I was fully invested in the game after about an hour or two in my playthrough. However, take a shot every time I say however. After about 20 hours of playing the game, the extreme cross-country distances you had to cover to get to the next story missions were a bit ridiculous. I know that the older games have the same system of fast travel, that of you needing a guide to take you to a different town, but these guides are in town, so you have to get to the town to fast travel. Bro, after I was told to head back the way I came and another 2 kilometers with broken gear and a full backpack, I was just wishing that the game would let me fast travel to the nearest town. Please, for the love of God. This is definitely a me problem, I can tell. But at what point does a challenging feature in a game become tedious for the player, causing the experience to falter a bit? Here's another example. If anybody played Dark Souls, the runbacks to the bosses were the worst. Especially, what's the worst runback in Dark Souls? Let me tell you. If you don't know the shortcut in Anne Orlando, it's definitely Ornstein and Small. But Manus, that's horrible. And that's what I mean. Look at what they did in Elden Ring. They put Statues of America right next to the boss fight, so you could just teleport to the... I mean, you could just spawn right next to the boss fight. None have to worry. That's a good change. Anyway, I could tell you that if I was given the chance to fast travel anywhere, the game would have been a complete home run for me. I like the game. I actually really do like the game. However, this isn't about my thoughts on the technical aspects of Stalker 2: Heart of Chernobyl. It's about how well they adapted Roadside Picnic. At the end of the day, whether you like an adaptation, it's really up to you. Like with most things, it's really up to you. I could go on and on about what makes an adaptation good, but ultimately it's a question that you should be asking yourself. Did I like this? Don't let people decide for you. You should be the one thinking and deciding whether something you are a fan of was giving the proper opportunity to branch out into other media and reach a greater audience. Or if that movie, television show, video game, etc. was actually a good piece of art, period. In these examples, the Stalker movie is absolute garbage that I wouldn't recommend to anybody, even if somebody was waterboarding me with gasoline. And the video game is a fun time if you don't mind a walking simulator from time to time. I've been your host, Cheeky Briki, and as always, goodbye.